Well, Cedar Waxwing is the subject of this small 10 by 7 inch watercolor. Got photo reference for this at Tawas State Park in Michigan. And I wanted to have a really blurry background for most of this, so I pre-wet the paper. And I had a bunch of pre-mixed blues and greens that I was going to use. So I put those on, letting gravity pull down the two blues, going from a cerulean to ultramarine blues. And then while the paper was still really wet, I went in and I started bringing in some of these greens for the trees that were going to be my blurry background. Because they're on that wet paper, they start to make blurry kind of patterns as they stretch across the wet paper. Once I put in a couple of darks for shadows on these trees to give some generic lighting to this background element, I went ahead and hit this with the hairdryer to lock in the pigments. Because the cerulean and ultramarine are both sedimentary pigments, they wanted to form this little kind of splotchy background, and I wanted to reduce that a little, so I did go over it another time to even out that the background a little. I don't mind some of that sedimentary look, but it was a little stronger than I wanted. So I decided to put some more blurry stuff in the background, and then for the more foreground elements toward the bottom of the page, I started bringing in some glazing in, some extra greens, paying attention to where the shadows were on each of these clumps of distant leaves. And you can see that I have all these pigments pre-mixed. I don't want to have to do this on the fly and be messing with the tubes and watering things down. By having it all pre-mixed, I'm able to work a little bit more quickly, and my thought work's done ahead of time, which is always a good thing to have. At this point, I was pleased with the background, so I peeled off the liquid frisket from the foreground elements. And now that I had all that nice white paper, I needed to transfer my sketch over. I used tracing paper and a folding bone to get that on. And now I have the landmarks that I can use to drop in the lightest local colors of all my foreground elements. So I just went about covering all those areas with the first tones. Trying to get around the whole page, not do any one section with a lot of detail. Just kind of work everything evenly. And as you can see, I'm just building detail with darks. Now, up to this point, everything was pretty much done with a number 6 round brush. And I'm just getting progressively darker. And you can see how I'm mixing the colors on the right-hand side with the butcher's tray. And now I'm bringing in some smaller brushes. For the browns, I did a lot of different things for the branches. And so that was, some parts of it were done with greeny gray kind of colors, and then for some of the warmer areas, I'd bring in some burnt sienna. That's a nice color to go to for those. And some of those same colors went in on the bird. On a painting like this, I've found that the birds go really quickly. It's all the branches that take so long, and sweating those details usually ends up making the painting look better than if it was just a single bird on a stick. And in my in the photo reference that I had, that I was painting from, I had a little bit more washed out sky. It was a little more lighter blue, and I wanted to play up some of those intense blues, just because I thought those would play well against the yellows of the Cedar Waxwing. You can see here that I've switched to a number 2 round brush to get some of the detail work. And you can also see from this that the quality of those blues, there is always a grainy kind of texture to those. If you're looking for a perfectly smooth background, ultramarine and cerulean are not going to give that to you. Personally, I like some of the personality that you get with having those, that slight, I don't want to say, it's almost like a crumbly texture you get, where you can actually see those little deposits of the blue paint on it. It's something that if you had a perfectly smooth background like you would get with an airbrush, for me, I find those a little boring. It's fun to actually see that this is paint, that this is, watercolor, that you can show a little bit of that medium in this, as opposed to having that perfectly smooth background. There's a place for that, but I find that these, I'm not trying to be photographic necessarily, so having some of that personality of the paint is kind of a nice thing, I think. So again, I'm getting detail by adding darks, and as I do this, I start mixing in less paint. My paint gets more opaque, and also I tend to be switching to smaller brushes as I go through the painting. And always glazing. If you were to put these real darks in early on, as you went over with a wetter wash, they're just going to run. So by waiting, you can get those crisp edges and not worry about them turning into a big puddly mess. And you can see I'm using a pretty tiny brush for some of these little details. I held off a while to put in the eye. Usually I hold off on those little details, beaks and eyes and feet, until later because they are tiny little things. Here I probably should have filled in the eye a little bit earlier just so it didn't look as blank. But often there's a tendency to, when you're doing these paintings, do all those tiny little details early. And over the years I've found that it's not the best way to do it. At least for me, that if you start with dessert, you don't have room for dinner, and that's the analogy I go by. If you wait for those smaller elements till later, you're less likely to quit working on the background, which is the majority of your painting. If you do those little elements first, the thrill's gone, and you kind of are more likely to quit early. So psychologically and artistically, I think it's best just to wait on the tiny details and do the big picture, build it all as a whole, and you'll end up with something that is more evenly developed. And also, I think the backgrounds usually are one of the things that make the paintings really good, for me at least. When I see someone who really, paints well, they usually have interesting backgrounds and there's an environment with it. Or sometimes you see a painting that's just somebody's done that's beautiful, but they've really thought through everything. Whether even if it's just a single bird or a bird portrait, you can see that they've given a lot of thought to how the thing's going to sit on the page, and everything's equally developed. One of the things with this painting that was difficult was really rounding out and giving dimension to the bird's belly. And birds have a thing called adaptive counter shading, where the underside's lighter than the top side, and this helps them hide and disguises them. If you're painting, that makes it more difficult because they tend to look a little less round. They tend to hide with their environment well, and you don't necessarily see some of these things that tell your eye, well, this sits behind the other object. And so in this one, I was really trying to get that bird's belly rounded out and still look white, fading to that yellow. And it was a difficult challenge with this bird, but rewarding. It was fun. well, here it was time for the signature, a couple last picks away at lichens and things like that. There's always something else to fix. And then I called it finished. So again, this was a Cedar Waxwing, transparent watercolor, 10 by 7 inches. If you get a chance, have a peek at the blog and the website. Thanks for watching.